Praised be Jesus and Mary. In the liturgy today, we celebrate a Franciscan saint, Saint Veronica Guiliani, a Capuchin Poor Clare, and not a well-known saint, neither here in the United States, but not even in her homeland of Italy. And this is a surprise and in some ways a shame, and we'll quickly see why as we get to know her. We'll look at, for her brief biography, and for some insights into her life, we'll look at a little catechesis that Pope Benedict XVI gave on her back in 2010, on the 15th of December. So who is this saint? Well, Veronica, her baptismal name was Ursula, was born on the 27th of December in 1660 in a little town called Mercatello in Italy. She was the last of 7 daughters, and her mom died when she was only 4, leaving her an orphan, at least on her mother's side. From an early age, Ursula felt a desire to follow Christ, to dedicate her life to Christ in a contemplative order. Her father would have liked to see her marry, but she resisted, she prayed, she insisted, and finally her dad gave her permission. At the age of 17, she entered the Poor Clare Monastery in Città di Castello in Umbria in Italy, and she was to remain there for the rest of her life. And here's an interesting insight. The Pope says that here she received the name of Veronica, which means what? True image. And she was in fact to become a true image of the crucified Christ. We'll go back to this thought a bit later on. A year later, after she entered, she made her solemn religious profession. Back then there was no temporary vows. You entered, you made your year of novitiate, and then you decided either you stayed forever or you went home. So after a year of novitiate, she made her solemn profession, and the process of configuration to Christ began for her through much penance, great sufferings, and several mystical experiences which linked to the passion of Jesus. She had countless mystical experiences, crowning with thorns, mystical espousals, she received the wound in her heart, the stigmata, and countless other mystical experiences. In 1716, when she was 56, through holy obedience, she became the abbess of her monastery. She was so humiliated by this and so overwhelmed that the first thing she did was to lay the keys of the monastery, the rule, these symbols of her authority, at the feet of Our Lady, a statue of Our Lady in the monastery, declaring that it would be Our Lady who would be the real abbess of this monastery. We'll go back to this later as well. We'll see how it was true in many ways, more than one. She, St. Veronica, was reconfirmed in this office until her death. She died in 1727. Her agony lasted 33 days and culminated in a joy so profound that her last words were, "I have found love. Love has let himself be seen. This is the cause of my suffering. Tell everyone about it. Tell everyone." On the 9th of July, at the age of 67, she died. And she was canonized in 1839 by Pope Gregory XVI. And when this Pope canonized her, he said something very interesting about this saint. He stated simply, this is the greatest mystic in the history of the Church after the Blessed Virgin Mary. Quite a statement. She's just the greatest mystic in the history of the Church, of course, after the Blessed Virgin Mary. So that's why it's a surprise that she's so little known, and a shame. Greatest mystic doesn't necessarily mean greatest saint in the history of the Church. Though St. Veronica was a colossal saint, and usually the two do go together. Great mystics are great saints, but not necessarily. Greatest mystic, in this case, simply means that among the known saints in the Catholic Church, she has had the greatest number of mystical gifts, probably all of them. All of the mystical gifts that you would read about in a book of spiritual theology you'll find in St. Veronica. In fact, she left a 22,000-page diary full of them. That's why it's a shame for all of us, a great loss for all of us, that both she, the saint, and her diary is so little known. Because mystical gifts, these gifts, extraordinary graces, are given not so much for the good of the saint himself or herself, but for the good and the edification of the mystical body, for our instruction, for our edification, to spur us on to sanctity, for the good of the Church, And we could go on interminably, going through these graces, going through this diary, the stigmata, as we said, crowning with thorns, mystical espousals, bilocations, visions of Our Lady. We could, just spend hours and hours examining her mystical graces. But instead, we'll focus on one. We'll go back to what Pope Benedict XVI said of her, saying that her name meant true image, Veronica. He said that she was in fact to become a true image of the crucified Christ. And this was the whole point of all her mystical experiences. The point was Christ becoming like the crucified Christ. And how did she specifically become a true image of the crucified Christ? And here we run into another crucial point in the spirituality of the saint. And here St. Veronica's devotion, ardent love for Our Lady comes into play. For St. Veronica, Our Lady is not just a gate, a necessary step, one of the necessary steps that you have to just, walk across to get to Christ that you leave behind afterwards. No, she's present throughout the spiritual life of this saint, as she is in all of our own spiritual lives, in all of Catholic spirituality. Our Lady leads us to Christ, but we never leave her behind. St. Veronica really incarnates what St. Maximilian would say later on. To illustrate this point, St. Maximilian used to say, well, when you go looking for the king, where do you look? You look inside the palace, deep inside the palace, at the very center of the palace. And if you don't, if you don't know all the insides of the palace, if you don't know the intimate structure of the palace, you'll never find the king. And to find that king, you can't leave the palace. You have to stay inside, and the more you get inside, the more you find him, the more you get to know the king. And so it was in the case of St. Veronica. And Pope Benedict here has another interesting insight. He cites one of the apparitions of Our Lady to St. Veronica, when Our Lady says to her, "I made you rest on my bosom. You were united with my soul, and from it you took flight before God." Three things happened. Our Lady intervened in the life of St. Veronica. "I made you rest on my bosom. You did nothing to deserve this, mystical grace. I made you rest on my bosom. You were united with my soul, and then after that, you went flying before God. You went off flying on a union with God. That's what really made you accelerate on your union with God." So St. Veronica, we can say, truly becomes a true image of Christ, because she becomes an image of Our Lady, of the Immaculate. Since no one is more like Christ than Our Lady, becoming an image of our Lord necessarily means becoming an image of Our Lady. The more we become like Christ, the more we become like Our Lady, out of necessity. And for the greatest glory of God and for the instruction and edification of all the faithful, and this was made very clear in St. Veronica through countless Marian experiences. One example, we said before that when she became abbess, she entrusted the keys and the government of the monastery to Our Lady. And Our Lady, really took this entrustment seriously. St. Veronica was taken many a time to purgatory and even to hell, mystically, to see the great sufferings of those souls who perhaps were suffering now because they did not become saints in life, or had lost their souls altogether and were now burning in hell. And when she was away, bilocating to purgatory and even to hell sometimes, the Virgin Mary would take the place of St. Veronica, appearing wearing her habit, assuming the appearances of St. Veronica. And the sisters had a tough time telling the difference. All they knew was that, during those days that, it was Our Lady taking the place of Mother Veronica. There was just simply something more heavenly about their abbess, maybe the sweetness of her voice, the gentleness of her charity, but they couldn't just put they couldn't put their finger on they couldn't quite put their finger on the difference. They weren't able to tell the difference. They couldn't tell the two apart. So was St. Veronica assimilated, united, made like Our Lady, and through her, like Christ. So it should be with us. This should be the lesson that we learn from St. Veronica today, and the grace we ask for, especially we who are consecrated to the Immaculate. So it should be with us if Our Lady were to come down from heaven and to take our place. For those who know us, it should be difficult to tell the difference. Sure, Our Lady would be holier than us. There would be something special about us during that time, but it would be difficult nonetheless to tell the difference. So may St. Veronica obtain for us this grace, the greatest of all graces we could hope for, to be so completely transformed into the Immaculate, to become so many other Veronicas, images, true images of our Lord and of Our Lady, and in that way, through the intercession of this saint, to become true images of Christ crucified. Praised be Jesus and Mary.